In the history of military art, there are few names that can be placed on a par with Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Suvorov. Alexander Vasilevsky is one of them. The modest son of a priest from the Kostroma hinterland, he became the architect of the greatest victories in human history. Under his leadership, operations were planned that turned the tide of World War II. From Stalingrad to Berlin, from Kursk to Manchuria, his strategic genius determined the fate of millions. How a simple staff officer became one of the best military strategists of the 20th century. Subscribe to our channel to learn more stories about great commanders and turning points in history. What do you think about the role of personality in history? Could anyone else have repeated Vasilevsky's strategic triumphs? Or were his successes the result of a unique combination of talent and circumstances? Share your opinion in the comments. In 1895, in the small village of Novaya Golchika in the Kostroma Governorate, a boy was born into the family of a rural priest who was destined to become one of the greatest military strategists in human history. Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky was born into a family where education and service were valued above all else. His father, Mikhail Alexandrovich, was not just a priest, but a man of broad horizons who instilled in his children a love of knowledge and discipline. Alexander's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of strictness and order, typical of clergy families of that time. From an early age, the boy showed remarkable abilities for analysis and systematic thinking. He could spend hours studying maps he found in his father's library, trying to understand the logic of the location of cities and roads. Who could have guessed that this childhood passion for maps would one day change the course of world history? Alexander was educated at the Kostroma Theological Seminary, where he proved himself to be an exceptionally gifted student. His teachers noted not only his brilliant academic achievements, but also his unusual ability for strategic thinking, which was unusual for a teenager. Vasilevsky could solve complex logical problems, see hidden connections between events, and predict how situations would develop. At the seminary, young Alexander studied not only theology, but also history, geography, and mathematics. He was particularly attracted to the military campaigns of the great commanders of the past. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon, trying to understand the principles of their strategic thinking. Could he have imagined then that he would one day stand alongside these great military leaders? His father wanted his son to continue the family tradition and become a priest. But Alexander had other plans. Already in seminary, he realized that his calling was related to military affairs. The young man was attracted, not by the romance of military service, but by its intellectual component, the art of strategy and tactics. After graduating from seminary in 1914, Vasilevsky made a decision that radically changed his life. Instead of enrolling in a theological academy, he applied to the Alexandrov Military School in Moscow. This decision caused conflict with his father, who could not understand how the son of a priest could choose a military career. At the military school, Alexander proved himself to be an exemplary cadet. His classmates recalled that he never stood out for his bravado or ostentatious courage, but possessed an amazing ability to analyze military problems in depth. Teachers noted his exceptional memory, his ability to quickly absorb large amounts of information, and his ability to see the big picture behind a multitude of details. But what turned a talented young man into a brilliant strategist? The answer to this question can be found in the characteristics of his personality, which were formed in childhood. Vasilevsky combined the iron discipline he inherited from his priest father with a natural curiosity and a desire for perfection. The completion of his education coincided with the outbreak of World War I. In 1914, the young Lieutenant Vasilevsky was assigned to the 109th Volga Infantry Regiment. A new chapter in the life of the future marshal began, a chapter that would show whether theoretical knowledge could be transformed into practical military skill. The family saw Alexander off to war with mixed feelings. His father, despite their previous disagreements, blessed his son and gave him advice about honor and duty. Could the priest have imagined that his blessing would lay the foundation for the future military triumphs of the Soviet Union? The First World War became a real university for the young Lieutenant Vasilevsky. As part of the 109th Volga Infantry Regiment, he encountered the harsh reality of modern warfare for the first time. Unlike the romantic notions of military service that may have remained after military school, the front showed Alexander the true face of armed conflict. The first months of service were spent in positional battles on the Austrian front. Vasilevsky commanded a company, and even then showed qualities that set him apart from other officers. He never sent soldiers into battle without first studying the terrain and calculating all possible scenarios. What shaped this caution in him, which later saved the lives of millions of Soviet soldiers? In 1915, Vasilevsky participated in the famous Brusilov offensive. This operation was a revelation for him. It was the first time he saw how a well-planned offensive could break through the enemy's seemingly impregnable defenses. The young officer carefully studied General Brusilov's methods and analyzed the principles of coordination between different branches of the military. Vasilevsky was particularly impressed by the artillery preparation system used during the breakthrough. Instead of the traditional prolonged shelling across the entire front, Brusilov concentrated his fire on narrow sections, achieving decisive superiority at key points. Who could have guessed that these observations by a young lieutenant would form the basis for future victories over the Wehrmacht? For his military achievements, Vasilevsky was awarded the Order of Saint Stanislaus, 3rd class, and promoted to staff captain. But more important than the awards was the combat experience he gained with each passing day. Alexander kept detailed records of enemy tactics, analyzed the successes and failures of Russian troops, and studied the latest weapons. In 1916, Vasilevsky was wounded, but after treatment he returned to duty. By this time, he had already established himself as an officer with an analytical mind, capable of seeing the big picture of battle. The command began to involve him in staff work, which allowed the young officer to study the art of war from a new perspective. Working in the staff opened up the world of strategic planning for Vasilevsky. He studied the principles of interaction between different units, learned to draw up combat orders, and analyzed intelligence data. It was here that his passion for staff work was born, which later brought the Red Army such brilliant victories. Alexander paid particular attention to the role of logistics in modern warfare. He understood that victory depended not only on the bravery of soldiers and the talent of commanders, but also on the ability to provide troops with everything they needed at the right time and in the right place. This knowledge proved invaluable in future campaigns of the Great Patriotic War. By the end of 1916, Captain Vasilevsky had been appointed Chief of Staff of the battalion. This position allowed him to fully demonstrate his organizational skills. Under his leadership, the battalion became one of the best in the regiment in terms of combat training and discipline. The revolutionary events of 1917 found Vasilevsky at the front. Like many officers, he was faced with a difficult choice: to support the provisional government, join the Bolsheviks, or try to remain neutral. What motives led the son of a priest to choose the red side in the looming civil war? The demobilization of the Russian army was chaotic. Vasilevsky saw the once powerful military machine falling apart, soldiers abandoning their positions and dispersing to their homes. This picture made an indelible impression on him and reinforced his understanding of the importance of discipline and order in military affairs. His return home in 1917 became a time of deep reflection for Vasilevsky. He analyzed the reasons for the defeat of the Russian army, studied the experience of other countries that had participated in the World War, and tried to understand what lessons could be learned from the catastrophe. These reflections by the modest captain would become the basis for revolutionary changes in military art. The choice made by Alexander Vasilevsky in 1918 determined not only his personal fate but also influenced the course of world history. After much deliberation, the former Tsarist captain decided to serve the new government. In May 1918, he voluntarily joined the Red Army, becoming one of the military specialists on whom the Bolsheviks relied. The decision was not easy for him. The son of an Orthodox priest and an officer in the Tsarist army, he understood that he was switching sides to a force that had declared war on his former world. What made this man believe in the ideals of the revolution? The answer lies in his patriotism and desire to serve Russia, regardless of who was in power. Vasilevsky's first assignment in the Red Army was as chief of the Operations Department of the Second Army of the Eastern Front. Here, he was confronted with the harsh reality of the Civil War. Unlike the positional warfare of World War I, this war was characterized by high maneuverability, rapid changes in the situation, and the need to make decisions in conditions of uncertainty. Working against Admiral Kolchak's troops, Vasilevsky was able to fully apply his analytical skills to planning large-scale operations for the first time. He studied the methods of the White Guard commanders, analyzed their strengths and weaknesses, and developed plans that took into account the specifics of civil conflict. It was during the Civil War that Vasilevsky's unique style as a military strategist was formed. He learned to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, use limited resources with maximum efficiency, and coordinate the actions of disparate units. These skills would prove invaluable in the future war against Nazi Germany. In 1919, Vasilevsky was transferred to the Southern Front to fight General Denikin's troops. There he worked under the future Marshal Yegorov, who highly appreciated the abilities of the young staff officer. His experience of working in the conditions of steppe warfare, where maneuverability and speed were of decisive importance, enriched Vasilevsky's tactical arsenal. His experience in planning operations against Mamontov and Shkuro's cavalry proved particularly valuable. Fighting highly mobile cavalry units required unconventional solutions and the ability to anticipate the enemy's actions several moves ahead. These skills would later help Vasilevsky outmaneuver German tank generals. In 1920, during the war with Poland, Vasilevsky served in the headquarters of the Western Front, under the command of Tukhachevsky. This campaign became a real school of modern warfare for him. He studied the principles of interaction between infantry, cavalry, and emerging mechanized units, and analyzed the role of aviation in combined arms operations. The Red Army's failures near Warsaw gave Vasilevsky valuable experience in analyzing his own mistakes. He studied the causes of defeat in detail and analyzed miscalculations in planning and coordination between fronts. This ability to learn from mistakes would become one of the main qualities of the great strategist. After the end of the Civil War, Vasilevsky remained in the Red Army. By this time, he had already established himself as one of the most capable staff officers. His analytical abilities, his ability to work with large amounts of information and see the big picture of an operation were highly valued by the command. Between 1920 and 1922, Vasilevsky held various staff positions, gaining experience in military planning. He studied the latest trends in military art, analyzed the experience of World War I, and followed the development of military thought in other countries. It was during these years that Vasilevsky formed the basic principles that would guide him in his future activities. Thorough preparation of operations, comprehensive analysis of the situation, creation of necessary reserves, and ensuring reliable communication between units. These principles, born in the crucible of the Civil War, would bring the Soviet Union its greatest victories in the fight against fascism. The Civil War ended, but for Vasilevsky, it was only the first step in his ascent to the heights of military mastery. Ahead of him lay years of study, improvement, and preparation for trials, the scale of which in 1922 was still impossible to imagine. The 1920s and 1930s were a period of intense professional growth for Vasilevsky and his development as an outstanding military theorist. After the end of the Civil War, the Red Army faced the task of transitioning from revolutionary enthusiasm to professional military development. It was during these years that the foundations were laid for the military machine that would defeat the Wehrmacht. In 1924, Vasilevsky entered the Frunze Military Academy, the highest military educational institution in the Soviet Union. There he received a fundamental military education, studied classical military art, and became acquainted with the latest theories of warfare. The Academy's teachers noted his exceptional ability to analyze and systematize military experience. Vasilevsky was particularly fascinated by the works of military theorists who developed the concept of deep operations. The theories of Tryandafilov, Tukhachevsky, and other Soviet military leaders on the massive use of tanks, aviation, and mechanized units made a deep impression on him. Who could have imagined that these theoretical studies would become the basis for future triumphs at Stalingrad and Kursk? After graduating from the academy in 1927, Vasilevsky was assigned to the headquarters of the Volga Military District. There he was involved in operational planning, participated in the development of mobilization plans, and studied the district's industrial capacity to supply troops in wartime. Working at the district headquarters gave Vasilevsky invaluable experience in military economic planning. He understood that modern warfare was not only a clash of armies, but also a competition between economic systems. Victory depended on the state's ability to mobilize all its resources to achieve its military objectives. In 1930, Vasilevsky was transferred to the General Staff of the Red Army. This appointment was a turning point in his career. In the country's central military body, he gained access to the most secret information and participated in the development of strategic defense plans for the Soviet Union. It was in the General Staff that Vasilevsky's analytical talent was fully revealed. He worked on plans to cover the western borders, analyzed the military doctrines of potential adversaries, and studied the capabilities of allies. His notes and reports were distinguished by their depth of analysis and accuracy of forecasts. Vasilevsky paid particular attention to studying the German military school. He closely followed military reforms in Germany, analyzed German military exercises, and studied the works of German theorists. This painstaking work would later allow him to accurately predict the plans of the Wehrmacht. In the mid-1930s, Vasilevsky participated in the development of new statutes for the Red Army. He was one of the authors of theoretical provisions on the conduct of modern warfare, the principles of interaction between different branches of the armed forces, and the organization of command in large-scale operations. The tragic events of 1937 to 1938 did not spare Vasilevsky. Many of his colleagues in the General Staff were arrested, and the military elite of the Red Army suffered heavy losses. How did the man who would later head the USSR's military planning survive in these conditions? Vasilevsky saved his life and career thanks to his professional competence and political caution. He never participated in political games, focusing exclusively on his professional activities. His reputation as a brilliant analyst and dedicated worker protected him from repression. In 1939, Vasilevsky was appointed Deputy Chief of the Operations Directorate of the General Staff. In this position, he was directly involved in planning military operations against Finland. The sad experience of the Winter War taught him an important lesson about the inadmissibility of underestimating the enemy. Analyzing the mistakes of the Finnish campaign, Vasilevsky came to the conclusion that a radical reform of the military planning system was necessary. He developed proposals to improve intelligence, enhance the quality of staff work, and strengthen cooperation between different branches of the armed forces. By the beginning of 1940, Colonel Vasilevsky was already considered one of the General Staff's leading experts on strategic planning. Ahead of him lay trials that would show how solid the theoretical knowledge he had accumulated over 2 decades of service really was. On June 22, 1941, at 4 a.m. Moscow time, the most terrible war in human history began. For Colonel Vasilevsky, who was at the General Staff at the time, Germany's attack did not come as a complete surprise. As an analyst, he understood the inevitability of the conflict, but the scale and suddenness of the attack exceeded even the most pessimistic predictions. What did a man who had spent years studying the German war machine, feel when he saw its terrifying effectiveness in action. Vasilevsky watched as carefully crafted plans to cover the border collapsed, as German tank wedges broke through the defenses and rushed deep into Soviet territory. In the first days of the war, the General Staff worked in a state of constant time pressure. Vasilevsky practically never left headquarters, analyzing reports coming in from the front lines, trying to understand the logic of the German offensive and find ways to counter it. The picture was catastrophic. Entire armies were surrounded, aircraft were destroyed at airfields, and tank corps were dying in unequal battles. Vasilevsky found it particularly difficult to report the real state of affairs to Stalin. The leader did not want to hear about defeats and demanded immediate counterattacks, often without taking into account the real capabilities of the troops. How could he find a balance between truthful information and the political demands of the leadership? In July 1941, Vasilevsky was appointed Deputy Chief of the General Staff for operational matters. This appointment came at a time of great crisis. The Germans were approaching Smolensk, and the road to Moscow was under threat. In these conditions, the lives of millions of people depended on Vasilevsky's analytical abilities. Studying the methods of the German blitzkrieg, Vasilevsky came to the conclusion that the main strength of the Wehrmacht lay in concentrating its efforts on narrow sections of the front. The Germans created overwhelming superiority at decisive points, broke through the defenses, and developed their success in depth. Understanding this principle would become the basis for future victories of the Red Army. One of the first tasks that Vasilevsky tackled in his new position was organizing the defense of Moscow. He helped set up the Mozhaisk defense line, planned the deployment of reserves, and worked out plans to evacuate key enterprises. Every decision had to be made under extreme time and resource constraints. In the fall of 1941, when the Germans launched their offensive on Moscow, Vasilevsky was able to fully apply his knowledge to planning a major defensive operation for the first time. He analyzed the possible directions of German attacks, planned an anti-tank defense system, and organized cooperation between the fronts. It was in the Battle of Moscow that Vasilevsky's strategic talent came to the fore. He was able to correctly assess the enemy's capabilities, predict the development of the operation, and propose optimal countermeasures. His analytical notes formed the basis for the decisions of the Supreme Command headquarters. His experience in planning the winter counteroffensive near Moscow proved particularly valuable. Vasilevsky participated in the development of the Typhoon and Mars operation plans, studying the possibilities of using winter conditions to strike the enemy's stretched communications. The success of the Moscow operation showed for the first time that the German army could not only be stopped, but also defeated. For Vasilevsky, this confirmed the correctness of his theoretical conclusions about the principles of modern warfare. The enemy was strong, but not invincible. By the end of 1941, Lieutenant General Vasilevsky was already considered one of the leading strategists of the Red Army. His ability to analyze the military situation in depth, his skill in seeing the prospects for the development of operations, and his talent for coordinating the actions of various fronts were recognized by both his colleagues and the country's top leadership. Ahead of him lay an appointment that would make him one of the key figures in achieving victory. On June 14th, 1942, an event occurred that radically changed the course of the Great Patriotic War. Lieutenant General Alexander Vasilevsky was appointed Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army. At the age of 47, he became the youngest person to hold this position in the history of the Russian and Soviet armies. What enabled the former son of a priest to lead the military planning of a great power at the most critical moment in its history? The answer lies in the unique combination of analytical skills, organizational talent, and a deep understanding of the principles of modern warfare that Vasilevsky had demonstrated over the previous months. The appointment came at an extremely difficult time. The Germans were preparing a summer offensive in 1942, aimed at capturing the Caucasus and the Volga region. Intelligence reported the concentration of large enemy forces in the southern direction. The new chief of the General Staff was tasked with deciphering the enemy's intentions and preparing an adequate response. Vasilevsky devoted his first days in his new position to a thorough analysis of the strategic situation. He studied all available intelligence data, analyzed the capabilities of various fronts, and assessed the state of the High Command's reserves. The picture that unfolded before him required radical decisions. The new chief of the General Staff paid particular attention to studying the German plans for Operation Blue. Analyzing the concentration of German troops, he came to the conclusion that the main strike would be delivered in the Stalingrad direction. This understanding became the basis for all subsequent strategic planning. Vasilevsky radically changed the working methods of the General Staff. He introduced a system of in-depth analysis of all incoming data, created groups of specialists to study specific areas, and established closer ties between the central apparatus and the front headquarters. These organizational innovations significantly improved the quality of strategic planning. One of Vasilevsky's first major decisions was to create powerful reserves in the Stalingrad area. Despite pressure from other areas, he insisted on concentrating large forces precisely where the enemy's main attack was expected. This decision required considerable courage, as a mistake could have led to disaster. In the summer of 1942, when the German offensive began in the south, Vasilevsky was able to fully apply his principles of strategic leadership for the first time. He did not try to stop the enemy at the border, but systematically withdrew his troops, preserving their combat capability and forcing the Germans to stretch their communications. It was under Vasilevsky's leadership that a strategy was developed that turned Stalingrad from defeat into the greatest victory. He understood that urban combat would tie down the German mobile formations, depriving them of their main advantage, maneuverability. At the same time, a powerful counteroffensive was being prepared from the flanks. The work of the Chief of the General Staff required Vasilevsky to work under enormous pressure. He reported daily to Stalin on the situation at the front, participated in meetings of the State Defense Committee, and coordinated the actions of various fronts. At the same time, he had to remain calm and analytical in the most critical situations. Relations with front commanders were particularly difficult. Many of them were older and more experienced than Vasilevsky, and not all of them were sympathetic to instructions from Moscow. It took a special talent to convince war-hardened generals of the correctness of centralized planning. Gradually, Vasilevsky's authority grew. His predictions of how the situation would develop were invariably accurate, and the solutions he proposed led to success. Front commanders began to understand that the new chief of the General Staff had a unique ability to see the big picture of the war. By the fall of 1942, under Vasilevsky's leadership, Operation Uranus had been developed, a plan for a counteroffensive near Stalingrad. This operation was to be a test of all the theoretical constructs of the new chief of the General Staff. Its success would determine not only the fate of the troops surrounded in the city, but also the entire course of the war. Planning Operation Uranus required Vasilevsky to mobilize all his accumulated knowledge and experience. It was necessary to secretly concentrate large forces, provide them with everything they needed, coordinate the strikes of 3 fronts, and anticipate the development of success. It was this operation that would show the world that, in Vasilevsky, the Red Army had found a brilliant strategist. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m., an operation began that turned the tide of World War II. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad, planned by Vasilevsky and codenamed Uranus, was a triumph of strategic thinking and a model of military art. How did a modest staff officer manage to develop a plan that outmaneuvered the best German generals? The secret of success lay in methodical preparation, in-depth analysis of the enemy's weaknesses, and precise calculation of forces and resources. Vasilevsky spent months studying every detail of the upcoming operation. Planning for Operation Uranus began in September 1942. Vasilevsky personally studied the terrain in the Stalingrad area, analyzed the enemy's forces and assessed the capabilities of the Soviet troops. He understood that the success of the operation depended on the secrecy of the preparations and the surprise of the attack. The Chief of the General Staff paid particular attention to the choice of directions for the main strikes. Having studied the location of German and Allied troops, he came to the conclusion that the most vulnerable positions were those of the Romanian armies on the flanks of the Stalingrad group. It was here that the Soviet tank units were to strike. Preparing for the operation required tremendous secrecy. Vasilevsky developed a system of disinformation measures designed to conceal the true intentions of the Soviet command from the enemy. Troops were moved only at night, radio communications were kept to a minimum, and secrecy was strictly observed. The coordination of the actions of the three fronts, Southwestern, Don, and Stalingrad, was a true masterpiece of military art. Vasilevsky personally developed plans for cooperation, determined the start time of the operation in each direction, and provided for possible scenarios under various circumstances. On the morning of November 19, 1942, what would later be called the Stalingrad cauldron began. Powerful artillery fire rained down on the positions of the Romanian Third Army. Then Soviet Tank Corps under the command of Generals Romanenko and Pliev rushed into the breach. During those days, Vasilevsky was in constant contact with the front commanders. He monitored the progress of the operation, adjusted plans depending on the situation, and made decisions to reinforce successful directions. His analytical mind worked at full capacity, processing streams of information from the battlefield. On November 23rd, units of the Southwestern and Stalingrad fronts met in the Kalach area. The encirclement of the Stalingrad enemy group was complete. 22 divisions, with a total strength of about 300,000 men, found themselves in the cauldron. The success of the first phase of the operation exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. But Vasilevsky understood that the most difficult part was still ahead. It was necessary not only to hold the encirclement, but also to repel the inevitable attempts to break out, and then destroy the surrounded group. It was during these days that Vasilevsky's strategic talent came to the fore. He did not succumb to the euphoria of initial success, but immediately began planning further actions. Realizing that the Germans would make desperate attempts to break through the ring, he prepared the necessary reserves in advance. Operation Winterstorm, an attempt to break the blockade of the encircled troops undertaken by Army Group Don under the command of Field Marshal Manstein, became a serious test for Vasilevsky's plans. Would the defense system he had created be able to withstand the onslaught of one of the best German commanders? Vasilevsky accurately predicted the direction of Manstein's main attack and concentrated the necessary forces there in advance. When the German tanks went on the offensive, they were met by echeloned anti-tank defenses. The bloody battles continued for several days, but the encirclement held. Simultaneously with repelling the attempt to break the blockade, Vasilevsky planned Operation Saturn, a strike against the remnants of the Italian army on the Middle Don. This operation was intended to finally thwart the enemy's plans to liberate the encircled troops and create the conditions for a general offensive on the southern wing of the front. By the end of December 1942, it became clear that Operation Uranus had been a complete success. The encircled group was doomed, attempts to break the blockade failed, and the initiative finally passed to the Red Army. Stalingrad became Vasilevsky's triumph and a turning point in the entire war. The spring of 1943 brought new challenges for Vasilevsky. After the brilliant success at Stalingrad, the German command was preparing for revenge. Operation Citadel, an offensive on the Kursk Bulge, was supposed to restore the Wehrmacht's strategic initiative and demonstrate to the whole world that the Reich's military machine was still capable of decisive action. Would the Chief of the General Staff be able to repeat the success of Stalingrad in completely different conditions? While Soviet troops had been on the offensive at Stalingrad, now they had to withstand a powerful enemy attack and then launch a counter-offensive. The task required a fundamentally different approach to planning the operation. Preparations for the Battle of Kursk began immediately after the end of the winter campaign of 1942 to 1943. Vasilevsky analyzed possible enemy plans, studied the concentration of German troops, and evaluated new models of equipment that the Germans planned to use in the upcoming battle. The Chief of the General Staff paid particular attention to studying the new German Tiger and Panther tanks and Ferdinand assault guns. Analysis of their tactical and technical characteristics showed that the Soviet troops would face a qualitatively new enemy. Unconventional solutions were needed to combat these steel monsters. In March 1943, intelligence reported the concentration of large German forces in the Orel and Belgorod areas. The nature of the grouping clearly indicated preparations for an attack on Kursk from the north and south, with the aim of encircling Soviet troops in the salient. Vasilevsky immediately understood the enemy's plan. The Soviet command was faced with a fundamental question: should they attack first, or wait for the German strike? After lengthy discussions, the High Command made a decision, largely based on Vasilevsky's analysis, to meet the enemy in defense, wear them down in defensive battles, and then launch a decisive counteroffensive. The creation of the defensive system on the Kursk Bulge became a model of military engineering. Under Vasilevsky's leadership, a system of echeloned defenses up to 200 kilometers deep was developed. Each line of defense was saturated with anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and firing points. Particular attention was paid to the creation of anti-tank strongpoints. Vasilevsky understood that the success of the defense depended on the ability to stop the German tank wedges. Entire anti-tank areas were created, equipped with the latest anti-tank guns, including the famous 45s. But Vasilevsky's main trump card was the powerful reserves concentrated in the Kursk area. The steppe front, under the command of General Konev, was supposed not only to parry a possible enemy breakthrough, but also to become the basis for a subsequent counter-offensive on Belgorod and Kharkov. Coordinating the actions of the 7 fronts participating in the Kursk operation required Vasilevsky to mobilize all the experience he had accumulated over the years of war. It was necessary to synchronize defensive actions, ensure the timely deployment of reserves, and prepare the transition from defense to offense. On July 5, 1943, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Operations Citadel began. A powerful artillery barrage rained down on the positions of the Central and Voronezh fronts. Then the best divisions of the Wehrmacht, including elite SS tank units, went on the attack. The fate of the entire operation was decided in the first days of the battle. Vasilevsky closely monitored developments, analyzed reports from the front lines, and made decisions about the deployment of reserves. The situation was particularly tense on the southern flank of the Arc, where Army Group South, commanded by Manstein, was advancing. The defensive battle culminated in the battle near the village of Prokhorovka on July 12th. Here, the largest tank forces clashed: the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army. The outcome of this battle determined the success of the entire Operations Citadel. Vasilevsky personally coordinated the actions of the troops in the Prokhorovka area. He understood that the outcome of the tank battle would determine not only the fate of the Kursk Bulge, but also the further course of the war. Soviet tankers fought with desperate bravery, preventing the Germans from breaking through the defenses. By July 15th, it became clear that the German offensive had run out of steam. The enemy suffered huge losses and failed to break through the Soviet defenses. The moment Vasilevsky had been waiting for had arrived: the time to launch a counteroffensive. Operations Kutuzov and Commander Rumyantsev were supposed to finally bury the enemy's plans and secure the liberation of Orel and Belgorod. On July 12, 1943, the very day when tank guns thundered near Prokhorovka, an operation began that demonstrated Vasilevsky's traditional genius in all its glory. The counteroffensive of the Western and Bryansk fronts against the enemy's Orel group was codenamed Kutuzov. in honor of the great Russian commander. How did the Chief of the General Staff manage to secretly prepare the largest offensive operation while simultaneously organizing the defense near Kursk? The secret lay in methodical planning and Vasilevsky's ability to keep track of many interrelated operations at the same time. Preparations for Operation Kutuzov began in May 1943. Vasilevsky understood that the success of the defensive battle must be immediately followed by offensive actions. While the Germans concentrated their forces for an attack on Kursk, Soviet troops secretly prepared for a counterattack. A distinctive feature of the planning was the use of experience gained in previous operations. Vasilevsky applied the principles developed at Stalingrad: surprise attack, concentration of forces on decisive directions, deep battle formations, and the creation of powerful reserves to build on success. The Ural salient was a powerful fortified area that the Germans had been improving for almost 2 years. It consisted of 3 lines of defense, saturated with long-range firing points, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. Breaking through such defenses required meticulous preparation. Vasilevsky personally studied aerial photographs of German positions, analyzed intelligence data, and planned the fire support system. Particular attention was paid to artillery preparation, which was intended not only to suppress enemy firing points, but also to demoralize their manpower. The coordination of several fronts within a single operation was a true masterpiece of military art. The Western Front, under the command of Sokolovsky, struck from the north, Popov's Bryansk Front from the east, and Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army was to develop the success in depth. On the morning of July 12, 1943, artillery preparation of unprecedented power began. More than 2,500 guns and mortars rained fire on German positions. The earth shook from the explosions, and the sky was filled with smoke from the blasts. Vasilevsky was at the observation post of one of the corps, personally supervising the artillery barrage. He understood that the success of the entire operation depended on the quality of the firepower. His analytical mind worked at full capacity, assessing the effectiveness of the fire on each target. After the artillery preparation, the infantry went on the attack, supported by tanks. The first day of fighting proved Vasilevsky's calculations to be correct. The German defenses were breached in several areas. Soviet troops advanced to a depth of 5 kilometers. Events developed particularly successfully in the sector of General Belov's 61st Army. Here, a breach 18 kilometers wide was created, into which the 20th Tank Brigade was immediately introduced. Vasilevsky immediately understood that this direction needed to be reinforced in order to build on the success. By the end of the first week of the operation, it became clear that the Germans would not be able to hold the Ural salient. Their reserves were tied up in battles near Kursk, and the group formed by Vasilevsky proved to be too powerful. A systematic retreat of German troops to pre-prepared positions began. It was at this moment that Vasilevsky's special talent became apparent: his ability to turn tactical success into strategic victory. He did not allow the enemy to consolidate their positions at intermediate lines, organizing a continuous pursuit of the retreating German troops. On August 5, 1943, Soviet troops liberated Ural. The city, which the Germans had turned into a powerful fortress, fell under the blows of the troops led by Vasilevsky from the General Staff. The salute in Moscow, in honor of the liberation of the 1st Regional Center, was a recognition of the commanding talent of the Chief of the General Staff. Simultaneously with Operation Kutuzov, an offensive was launched in the Belgorod-Kharkov direction. Operation Commander Rumyantsev was supposed to complete the defeat of German troops on the southern flank of the Kursk Bulge and open the way for the liberation of left bank Ukraine. The success of both operations marked a turning point in the war. The strategic initiative finally passed to the Red Army. German plans for revenge were buried, and Soviet troops were able to launch a general offensive across the entire front. The autumn of 1943 was marked by new triumphs for Vasilevsky. After the successes at Kursk and the liberation of Orel and Belgorod, the Red Army had tremendous prospects ahead of it. The German front had cracked, and Soviet troops were preparing to cross the Dnieper, a water barrier that the Germans called the Eastern Wall and considered impregnable. How could tactical successes be turned into a strategic breakthrough that would lead to the liberation of the whole of Ukraine? This question became central to Vasilevsky's plans for the autumn-winter campaign of 1943 to 1944. Planning for operations to cross the Dnieper began as early as August 1943. Vasilevsky understood that the Germans were using the time of their retreat to strengthen their defensive positions on the western bank of the river. There was no time to delay. Every day of delay meant additional casualties. A distinctive feature of the Dnieper operation was its enormous length. The crossing was planned on a front stretching from Smolensk to Zaporizhia, more than 700 kilometers. No commander in world history had ever had to coordinate the actions of so many fronts at the same time. Vasilevsky developed a fundamentally new concept for breaking through a fortified water barrier. Instead of concentrating his efforts in one direction, he planned multiple crossings across the entire front. This was intended to prevent the Germans from concentrating their reserves to repel a specific threat. Preparing for the crossing required solving a multitude of technical problems. Pontoons, boats, amphibious vehicles, and engineering equipment were needed. Vasilevsky personally supervised the delivery of the necessary resources, understanding that the success of the entire operation depended on the quality of the engineering support. On September 22, 1943, the crossing of the Dnieper began. In the silence of the night, thousands of Soviet soldiers began crossing the water barrier using whatever means they had at their disposal: boats, rafts, and logs. This was the moment of truth for Vasilevsky's plans. The first day of the crossing proved to be extremely successful. Soviet troops managed to establish several bridgeheads on the western bank of the Dnieper. A particularly large bridgehead was captured in the Kiev area by troops of the 1st Ukrainian Front under the command of General Vatutin. The success of the crossing proved the correctness of Vasilevsky's strategic plan. The Germans were unable to repel attacks on all fronts at the same time. Their reserves rushed from one section to another, unable to eliminate the bridgeheads created by Soviet troops. Particularly dramatic events unfolded in the Kiev area. Vasilevsky understood that the liberation of the Ukrainian capital was not only of military, but also of enormous political significance. He personally planned the operation to expand the Kiev bridgehead and prepare for the assault on the city. On November 6, 1943, the 26th anniversary of the October Revolution, Soviet troops liberated Kiev. The ancient capital of Rus was returned after 2 years of occupation. The salute in Moscow, in honor of the city's liberation, was one of the most solemn of the entire war. The success of the Kiev operation opened the way for Soviet troops to the right bank Ukraine. Vasilevsky immediately began planning further offensive operations. The goal was to liberate the entire territory of Ukraine and reach the borders of Romania and Poland. But the main achievement of the autumn campaign of 1943 was the final collapse of the German strategy in the east. The Eastern Wall, the last hope of the German command for stabilizing the front, was breached. The Red Army gained operational space for further action. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, Vasilevsky planned operations to liberate Crimea and right bank Ukraine. The Korsun-Shevchenko operation was to become a new triumph of Soviet military art. In January 1944, an offensive began in the Korsun-Shevchenko direction. Soviet troops surrounded a large German group, repeating the success of Stalingrad in miniature. Vasilevsky showed that the art of encircling the enemy had become the hallmark of Soviet military planning. By the spring of 1944, the entire right bank of Ukraine had been liberated. The Red Army reached the borders of Romania and Moldova. The next target was the Baltic states, a region whose liberation would require Vasilevsky to solve new complex strategic problems. The year 1944 became a year of great strategic triumphs for Vasilevsky. By the summer, the Red Army had liberated a significant part of the occupied territory. But a task of colossal complexity lay ahead. Operation Bagration, designed to defeat Army Group Center and liberate Belarus. This operation was to be a masterpiece of military art, a demonstration of how the theory of deep operations could be turned into devastating practice. Vasilevsky understood that the success of Bagration would open the way to Berlin and bring the war to an end. Planning for the operation began in April 1944. Vasilevsky carefully studied the enemy's forces, analyzed the German fortifications, and assessed the capabilities of the Soviet troops. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Bush, numbered about 1.2 million men. A distinctive feature of the planning was the use of experience gained in all previous operations. Vasilevsky used the principles of surprise, tested at Stalingrad, methods of breaking through fortified defenses, tested at Kursk, and the art of encirclement, demonstrated on the Dnieper. The key idea behind Operation Bagration was to strike simultaneously at all the main centers of enemy resistance. Instead of a sequential breakthrough of the defenses, synchronized strikes by four fronts were planned with the aim of dismembering and destroying the German group in parts. Preparations for the operation were carried out in strict secrecy. Vasilevsky developed a set of disinformation measures designed to convince the German command that the main strike would be delivered in the Ukrainian direction. Troops were transferred to Belarus only at night. Particular attention was paid to artillery preparation. An unprecedented artillery force was concentrated in Belarus. More than 31,000 guns and mortars. Vasilevsky planned to crush the German defenses with a barrage of unprecedented force. The coordination of the actions of four fronts, the 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Belarusian, was the pinnacle of Vasilevsky's military artistry. Each front was given specific tasks, but all actions were coordinated from a single center. At 5 o'clock in the morning on June 23, 1944, the artillery preparation for Operation Bagration began. The earth shook from the blows of thousands of guns. German positions disappeared in the fire and smoke of the explosions. German soldiers had never seen such a concentration of fire before. After the artillery preparation, the infantry went on the attack, supported by tanks. Already on the first day, it became clear that the German defenses could not withstand the blow. Soviet troops broke through the enemy's defenses in several directions at once. Events developed particularly successfully in the direction of the main strike of the 3rd Belarusian Front. General Chernyakhovsky's troops broke through the German defenses north of Vitebsk and rushed deep into enemy territory. By the end of the first day of the offensive, Soviet tanks had advanced 25 kilometers. Vasilevsky closely monitored the progress of the operation from the general staff, maintaining constant contact with the front commanders. He understood that the success of the first days had to be developed immediately, without giving the enemy the opportunity to regroup and create new defensive lines. By June 27th, the contours of a grand success were becoming clear. Soviet troops surrounded large enemy groups in the Vitebsk and Bobruisk areas. German divisions found themselves in the same cauldrons that they themselves had created in 1941. Particularly dramatic events unfolded in the Minsk area. Vasilevsky planned a complex maneuver in which the tank corps of the 3rd and 1st Belarusian fronts were to meet west of the Belarusian capital, closing the encirclement around the main forces of Army Group Center. On July 3, 1944, Soviet troops liberated Minsk. The remnants of 4 German armies, more than 100,000 soldiers and officers, were surrounded west of the city. It was a triumph of Vasilevsky's strategic planning, repeating and surpassing the success of Stalingrad. The success of Operation Bagration exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. In 2 weeks of fighting, Army Group Center was virtually destroyed. The Germans lost 28 divisions, and the front was broken through for 450 kilometers. But Vasilevsky did not stop there. He understood that this success had to be immediately developed in the direction of the Baltic states. The liberation of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia would be a logical continuation of the Belarusian operation and would completely clear Soviet territory of invaders. Planning for the Baltic operations began during Operation Bagration. Vasilevsky analyzed the capabilities of the German Army Group North, studied the fortifications built by the enemy during 3 years of occupation, and assessed the difficulties of an offensive in wooded and marshy terrain. The Baltic operation required Vasilevsky to solve fundamentally new problems. While in Belarus, the Soviet troops advanced across open terrain. Here they had to overcome powerful fortifications covered by natural obstacles. On September 14, 1944, the Baltic strategic operation began. 3 fronts, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts, under the overall command of Vasilevsky, launched an offensive with the aim of liberating the Baltic republics and defeating Army Group North. A distinctive feature of the Baltic battles was the need to storm large fortified cities. Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius had been turned into powerful fortresses by the Germans. Vasilevsky developed tactics for urban combat that minimized losses during the assault on fortified positions. By October 1944, Soviet troops had liberated Riga and blocked the remnants of Army Group North in the Courland pocket. German troops, which had once threatened Leningrad, found themselves pushed back to the sea and unable to take active action. The success of the Baltic operation completed the liberation of Soviet territory. The enemy was expelled from the land it had trampled on for 3 years. The Red Army gained a foothold for an offensive against East Prussia and Poland. On October 13, 1944, Soviet troops entered the territory of East Prussia, historically German land. This was a symbolic act of retribution for all the crimes committed by the invaders on Soviet soil. The war was drawing to a close. By the end of 1944, under Vasilevsky's leadership, a huge territory had been liberated, stretching from Karelia to the Black Sea. The German army groups North and Center were defeated, opening the way to Germany. Ahead lay the final campaign of the war, the storming of Berlin. January 1945 marked the beginning of the final campaign of the Great Patriotic War. Vasilevsky faced a monumental task: to plan an operation that would lead Soviet troops to Berlin and complete the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Vistula-Oder strategic operation was to be the crowning achievement of his military career. What needed to be done to overcome the last 400 kilometers to the lair of the fascist beast? The Germans had turned every city and every village into a fortress. They understood that they were fighting for the existence of their state and were ready to defend themselves with the desperation of the doomed. Planning for the Vistula-Oder operation began in December 1944. Vasilevsky analyzed the powerful German fortifications along the Vistula and Oder rivers, studied the enemy's ability to transfer reserves, and assessed the difficulties of a winter offensive in the conditions of the Central European plain. A special feature of the planning was the need to coordinate actions with the Allies. Anglo-American troops were advancing from the west, and it was necessary to synchronize strikes from the east and west to prevent the Germans from maneuvering reserves between the fronts. The key idea of the operation was a rapid advance to the Oder, followed by a crossing of the river, and the creation of bridgeheads for the assault on Berlin. Vasilevsky planned to advance 400 kilometers in 2 to 3 weeks, not allowing the enemy to consolidate their positions at intermediate lines. At 6:30 a.m. on January 12, 1945, a powerful artillery barrage began. More than 25,000 guns and mortars of the 1st Belarusian Front, under Zhukov's command, rained fire on German positions west of Warsaw. At that moment, Vasilevsky was at an observation post of one of the armies, personally supervising the artillery barrage. He understood that the pace of the entire operation depended on the quality of the firepower. Every minute of delay gave the enemy an opportunity to bring up reserves. After the artillery preparation, Kutuzov and Bogdanov's tank armies went on the offensive. Powerful tank wedges broke through the German defenses and rushed deep into enemy territory. By the end of the first day of the offensive, Soviet tanks had advanced 30 kilometers. On January 17th, Soviet troops liberated Warsaw. The Polish capital, reduced to ruins by the Germans after the Warsaw Uprising, was free once again. The liberation of Warsaw was of enormous political significance. It symbolized the collapse of the new order in Europe. The success exceeded all expectations. German defenses collapsed across the entire front. Soviet tank corps advanced rapidly westward, bypassing pockets of resistance and preventing the enemy from consolidating their positions on new lines. Vasilevsky watched his dream come true, a maneuver war on a European scale. Particularly dramatic events unfolded in East Prussia. Here, the Third Belarusian Front, under the command of Chernyakhovsky, stormed the powerful fortifications of the East Prussian Wall. The battles in East Prussia were among the fiercest of the entire war. By the end of January, Soviet troops had reached the Oder River on a front stretching over 100 kilometers. Berlin was only 60 kilometers away. The pace of the offensive was so rapid that even Vasilevsky himself was surprised by the scale of the success. The crossing of the Oder was a new triumph of Soviet military art. Despite fierce enemy resistance, Soviet troops managed to capture several bridgeheads on the west bank of the river. The bridgehead in the Kustrin area was particularly important, as it covered the shortest route to the German capital. But Vasilevsky understood that the assault on Berlin would require careful preparation. The mistakes made during the assault on other fortresses could not be repeated. Berlin had been turned into a powerful citadel, with every house becoming a fortress. February and March 1945 were spent preparing for the decisive assault. Vasilevsky planned the operation to capture Berlin, studied the city's defense system, and analyzed the experience of street fighting in other cities. The final operation of the war had to be planned. By April 1945, everything was ready for the final blow. 3 fronts, the 1st and 2nd Belarusian and the 1st Ukrainian, concentrated more than 2.5 million soldiers at the walls of Berlin. The greatest fortress in human history was preparing for its final assault. Vasilevsky understood the historical significance of the upcoming operation. The fall of Berlin meant the end of the Third Reich and victory in the most terrible war in human history. Not only military reputation was at stake, but also the fate of millions of people. At 3 o'clock in the morning on April 16, 1945, an operation began that went down in history as one of the most grandiose in the history of military art. The Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation was the final chord in a symphony of victories conducted by Alexander Vasilevsky. How to storm a city that the Germans had turned into an impregnable fortress. Berlin was protected by 3 defensive rings, each of which was a system of reinforced concrete fortifications, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. The city was home to the remnants of the once formidable Wehrmacht and fanatical SS units. Planning the Berlin operation required Vasilevsky to mobilize all the experience he had accumulated over the years of war. It was necessary to combine the art of breaking through fortified defenses, perfected at Kursk, the methods of urban combat, tested at Stalingrad, and the principles of coordinating large units, applied in Operation Bagration. A special feature of the planning was the need to take political factors into account. Berlin was to be taken by Soviet troops. That was the decision of the country's leadership. This placed additional responsibility on Vasilevsky. The Red Army could not be allowed to be overtaken by the Allies. Coordinating the actions of 3 fronts in dense urban areas became the pinnacle of military art. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front advanced from the east, Konyev's 1st Ukrainian Front from the southeast, and Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front was to cover the operation from the north. The artillery preparation for the Berlin operation was the most powerful of the entire war. 41,600 guns and mortars rained fire on German positions for 2 hours. The earth shook from the explosions, and the sky was lit up by the glow of the explosions. Vasilevsky personally observed the artillery preparation from the command post of the First Belarusian Front. He understood that the success of the assault depended on the quality of the firepower. Each shell brought the end of the most terrible war in human history closer. After the artillery preparation, the attack began. The first to go into battle were assault groups, specially trained for urban combat. They were followed by tanks, sappers, and flamethrowers. Every house had to be taken by force. Every street became a battlefield. Particularly fierce fighting broke out for the Zilo Heights, a key position in the German defense on the approaches to Berlin. The best units of the Wehrmacht, commanded by General Heinrici, were concentrated here. Breaking through the Zilo Heights was the key to Berlin. On April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Soviet artillery began shelling the center of Berlin. Shells exploded near the Reich Chancellery, where the Führer was hiding in an underground bunker. The symbolism of the moment was obvious. The regime received a gift for its leader's anniversary in the form of Soviet shells. On April 21st, the advanced units of the First Belarusian Front broke into the suburbs of Berlin. Street fighting began in the very heart of the Third Reich. Every block had to be stormed, every building turned into a fortress. Vasilevsky coordinated the actions of the assault units, preventing the dispersion of forces. The main target was the Reichstag, the symbol of German statehood. The capture of this building was to become a symbol of the final victory over fascism. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in an underground bunker in the Reich Chancellery. Upon learning of this, Vasilevsky realized that the war was practically over. All that remained was to force the remnants of the German troops to surrender. On May 2nd, 1945, the Berlin garrison surrendered. The red banner over the Reichstag became a symbol of the Soviet people's victory in the Great Patriotic War. The operation planned by Vasilevsky was a complete triumph. But the war was not yet over. The remnants of Army Group Center continued to fight in Czechoslovakia. The Prague operation was to put an end to the most terrible war of the 20th century. On May 6th, the Red Army launched its final offensive in Europe. Soviet troops advanced rapidly towards Prague, encountering no serious resistance. German soldiers surrendered en masse, realizing the futility of further resistance. On May 9, 1945, in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Germany was signed. The war in Europe ended with the complete victory of the anti-Hitler coalition. Vasilevsky could proudly say that his strategic genius had made a decisive contribution to this victory. On May 9, 1945, the war in Europe ended. But Vasilevsky still had one more monumental task ahead of him. In the Far East, the million-strong Kwantung Army, considered the elite of the Japanese armed forces, continued to fight. It was necessary to plan an operation that would force Japan to surrender and finally end World War II. As early as May 1945, Vasilevsky began studying the situation in the Far Eastern theater of war. During their years of occupation of Manchuria, the Japanese had created a powerful system of fortifications, turning the captured territory into an impregnable fortress. The Far Eastern campaign was characterized by vast distances and difficult climatic conditions. The offensive would have to be carried out in mountainous and desert terrain, crossing the Greater Khingan Range and numerous rivers. No commander in history had ever had to wage such a war. Planning the Manchurian strategic operation required Vasilevsky to take into account many factors. It was necessary to secretly transfer huge forces to the Far East, provide them with everything they needed, and plan the interaction of 3 fronts in a territory larger than the whole of Europe. The key idea of the operation was to rapidly encircle the Kwantung Army from several directions at once. The Transbaikal Front was to advance through the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountains, the first Far Eastern Front along the Amur River, and the second Far Eastern Front in Primoria. Preparations for the operation were carried out in strict secrecy. The best units that had participated in the Berlin operation were transferred from the west to the Far East. The transfer of such a large number of troops and equipment was a logistical feat. Vasilevsky personally arrived in the Far East to lead the operation. He understood that the success of the campaign depended on the precise coordination of all fronts. The slightest mistake in planning could result in disaster, given the vast distances and difficult terrain. At 1 o'clock in the morning on August 9, 1945, the Manchurian Strategic Offensive Operation began. Simultaneously with the start of the Soviet offensive, the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Japan found itself between the hammer of the Soviet offensive and the anvil of atomic weapons. The success of the operation exceeded all expectations. The Transbaikal Front, under the command of Malinovsky, rapidly crossed the Gobi Desert and the Greater Khingan Mountains, which were considered impassable. Japanese generals did not expect an attack from this direction. General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army performed particularly brilliantly. In 4 days, Soviet tanks covered more than 700 kilometers of mountainous desert terrain and reached the operational space of the Manchurian Plain. At the same time, the First Far Eastern Front, under the command of Meretskov, broke through the Japanese defenses in the Mudanyan area and rushed towards Harbin. Berkayev's 2nd Far Eastern Front advanced in Primoria, threatening Japanese communications with Korea. By August 12th, it was clear that the Kwantung Army was doomed. Soviet troops had divided the Japanese forces into isolated units, depriving them of the ability to maneuver with reserves. The pace of the offensive was so rapid that the Japanese did not have time to organize their defenses on the new front lines. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. But some Japanese units continued to resist. Vasilevsky decided to continue the offensive until the enemy was completely defeated. The Manchurian operation was a triumph of Vasilevsky's strategic art. In 11 days, a 1 million-strong enemy force was defeated, and an area of more than 1.5 million square kilometers was liberated. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese surrender was signed aboard the American battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II was finally over. Vasilevsky could proudly say that he had made a decisive contribution to the victory over fascism and militarism. The Far Eastern Campaign was the final chord in Vasilevsky's military career. He demonstrated his ability to plan and conduct operations in all conditions. From the steppes near Stalingrad to the deserts of Mongolia, from the forests of Belarus to the streets of Berlin. For his outstanding achievements in planning and conducting the Manchurian operation, Vasilevsky was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. But the greatest reward for him was the knowledge that he had fulfilled his duty to his country and to humanity. Victory in the war opened a new chapter in Vasilevsky's life. The Marshal, whose name is forever inscribed in history as the creator of the greatest strategic operations of the 20th century, now faced the task of peaceful construction. How could he apply his accumulated military experience in peacetime? In September 1945, Vasilevsky was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces in the Far East. He faced the difficult task of demobilizing a multi-million-strong army, settling the liberated territories, and establishing peaceful life in a region that had survived Japanese occupation. The organizational talent that Vasilevsky had demonstrated during the war proved useful in peacetime as well. He approached each problem methodically, applying the same systematic analysis that had helped him plan military operations. The Marshal paid particular attention to the restoration of the Far East's economy. It was necessary to get businesses up and running, restore transport links, and provide the population with food. This work required the same qualities as military planning: the ability to see the big picture and coordinate many directions at once. In 1949, Vasilevsky was appointed Minister of the Armed Forces of the USSR. In this position, he was involved in reorganizing the army in the context of the beginning of the Cold War. The advent of nuclear weapons radically changed the nature of military conflicts. Vasilevsky understood that military art was entering a new era. The experience of World War II remained valuable, but many principles needed to be rethought in light of the emergence of weapons of mass destruction. He actively studied the possibilities of using nuclear weapons for military purposes. In 1952, the Marshal was appointed first Deputy Minister of Defense of the USSR. In this position, he oversaw strategic planning issues and participated in the development of the Soviet Union's military doctrine in the context of a bipolar world. Vasilevsky's experience in strategic planning proved to be in demand even in peacetime. He participated in the development of the country's defense plans, analyzed the military capabilities of potential adversaries, and coordinated the development of various types of armed forces. In addition to his official duties, Vasilevsky was actively involved in literary work. His memoirs, the work of a lifetime, became one of the best works of memoir literature about the Great Patriotic War. In this book, the Marshal shared the secrets of military art and talked about the behind-the-scenes side of strategic decision-making. Vasilevsky's reflections on the principles of military planning are particularly valuable. He formulated the basic requirements for a modern military commander: deep theoretical knowledge, the ability to analyze large amounts of information, and the ability to foresee the development of events several moves ahead. Vasilevsky always emphasized the role of collective intelligence in achieving victory. He believed that the success of operations was achieved not by the genius of one person, but by the coordinated work of the entire staff. Every officer had to contribute to the common cause. In 1957, due to deteriorating health, Vasilevsky left active service. But even in retirement, he continued to engage in military theory work, advising the country's leadership on defense issues and passing on his experience to young officers. Vasilevsky's influence on the development of the Soviet military school cannot be overestimated. His principles of operational planning, methods of coordinating various branches of the armed forces, and approaches to analyzing the military situation became the basis for the training of an entire generation of military leaders. On December 5, 1977, Marshal Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky passed away. He left behind an invaluable legacy: the experience of the greatest military victories and theoretical developments that enriched the world of military art. Vasilevsky's name will forever remain a symbol of strategic genius. The modest son of a priest from the Kostroma countryside managed to rise to the heights of military mastery and make a decisive contribution to the victory over fascism. Vasilevsky's legacy lives on today. His principles of military planning are studied in military academies around the world. The strategic operations planned by this outstanding commander remain a model of military art for all times.